Welcome to another lecture on the European Union, the only political entity on Earth that can look at a dying houseplant and decide that what it desperately needs is a legally binding directive of 300 pages. Today we are discussing the Nature Restoration Law. It is one of the most sweeping, polarizing, and ambitious pieces of environmental legislation in history. Brussels has decided to formally legislate the concept of the great outdoors. The motivation behind this immense bureaucratic effort is quite simple. According to the European Environment Agency, 81% of Europe's natural habitats are in poor or bad condition. We have essentially paved over, drained, or intensely farmed the continent until it resembles a giant outdoor factory. The bees are disappearing, the butterflies are packing their tiny bags, and the soil is exhausted. For decades, the EU tried to simply protect whatever pristine nature was left. But they quickly realized that merely putting a fence around a dying forest was not actually saving it. So Brussels decided it was time to actively intervene. The central goal of the Nature Restoration Law is staggering. It legally mandates the restoration of 20% of the European Union's land and sea areas by the year 2030, and all ecosystems in need of restoration by 2050. The Commission justifies this colossal effort not just with environmental sentimentality, but with cold, hard economics. They calculate that every euro invested in nature restoration delivers between 8 and 38 euros in benefits through ecosystem services like flood protection, climate mitigation, and better harvests. But nature restoration in EU terms does not just mean leaving things alone. It requires active, heavily documented intervention. For example, one of the primary targets is restoring at least 25,000 kilometers of rivers to a free-flowing state. This means tearing down obsolete dams, ancient weirs, and barriers that were built decades ago. The fish must be allowed to migrate naturally, and the rivers must be allowed to flood their historical plains to prevent catastrophic downstream disasters in human settlements. Then we have the bogs, peatlands, to be precise. Historically, peatlands are the ultimate carbon sinks. An undisturbed bog stores more carbon than a forest. But for centuries, Europeans have been systematically draining them to create highly productive agricultural land. If you recall our lecture on the Common Agricultural Policy, the European Union actually spent decades heavily subsidizing the draining of these wetlands to boost food production. Now, in a spectacular twist of bureaucratic irony, the EU wants to use public money to make them wet again. The law originally required member states to re-wet massive swathes of drained peatlands that are currently under agricultural use. And as you might imagine, telling a farmer that his great-grandfather's hard-won wheat field needs to become a muddy swamp did not go over very well. Enter the tractors. The Nature Restoration Law sparked massive protests across the continent. Farmers descended on Brussels, blocking streets, lighting fires, and honking horns to express their profound displeasure with the entire rewilding agenda. The agricultural lobby and conservative politicians argued that taking land out of production would fatally threaten Europe's food security. They claimed that in a world of supply chain crises and geopolitical instability, giving premium farmland back to the frogs was absolute legislative madness. The political battle was unprecedented. The largest center-right political group in the European Parliament actually walked out of negotiations, attempting to kill the bill entirely. They argued it was simply too much red tape for rural communities that were already drowning in regulations. The law barely survived. It passed by a razor-thin margin and was heavily watered down. To appease the farming sector, the final text includes a literal emergency brake that can completely suspend the restoration targets if there is a severe threat to food production. Furthermore, the re-wetting of agricultural land was made entirely voluntary for private landowners. The burden of achieving the quotas now falls almost exclusively on state-owned lands, meaning member states have to figure out how to restore nature without legally forcing farmers to give up their property. But do not think the nature restoration law is just about harassing people in the countryside. It also heavily targets the concrete jungles. The law establishes a strict rule that there can be no net loss of urban green spaces anywhere in the bloc. In fact, the law mandates a strict no net loss of green space by 2030 and legally requires cities to actually start increasing their green canopies every year thereafter. This means tearing up unused parking lots, planting vast urban canopies, and forcing nature into the urban planning of every major European metropolis, whether the real estate developers like it or not. There are also incredibly specific targets for pollinators. Member states are legally required to reverse the decline of bee and butterfly populations by 2030, and then achieve an increasing trend every single year thereafter, measured through mandatory, regular pollinator censuses. To execute all of this, every single member state must draft a national restoration plan. They have 2 years to submit a detailed roadmap to the European Commission, explaining exactly which rivers they will unblock, which bogs they will flood, and how they will count the butterflies. Despite all the chaotic compromises, the tractor protests, and the heavy bureaucracy, it remains a landmark piece of legislation. It is the first comprehensive, continent-wide law that shifts the focus from merely protecting whatever nature is left to actively rebuilding what we destroyed. So whether we end up with a beautifully restored continental Eden or just a massive pile of recycled paper detailing our failure remains to be seen. I suppose we will just have to let nature take its course, subject to a parliamentary majority, of course. Class dismissed.